Cabrini Green, Chicago, Illinois. Picture a chilly evening in March 1981, the kind of cold where your breath fogs the air and your fingers numb inside your gloves. Inside the lobby of the high-rise tower at 1150 to 1160 North Sedgwick Street, a small band has been hired to play a dance. Folding chairs are scattered across the floor. People are smiling, swaying, holding plastic cups. The singer steps up to the microphone, and for one brief moment, the building they all called The Rock feels like a community center instead of a fortress. Then a young man named Jerry Mouseman Lusby, a member of the Cobra Stones street gang, parts the crowd, raises a pistol, and squeezes the trigger. Singer Larry Potts crumples to the floor before the next note can leave his throat. Stray bullets find their way into the bodies of two children who had come for a night of dancing. By the time Chicago detectives arrived to take statements, residents of Cabrini Green had stopped being surprised by gunfire in their own lobby. In early 1981 alone, the complex saw 11 murders and 37 shootings. Mayor Jane Byrne would famously move into a neighboring unit for several weeks to prove the city had control of the situation. The moment she packed her bags and left, the gunfire returned to its regularly scheduled programming. Cabrini Green did not start out this way. It began as a hopeful experiment in urban renewal. The Francis Cabrini row houses opened in the early 1940s, joined later by the high-rise William Green homes built between 1958 and 1962. The towers were supposed to be modern, dignified housing for working families, planted in the shadow of Chicago's wealthy Gold Coast. But decades of segregation, decades of underfunding, and decades of polite indifference from City Hall turned the brick and concrete monoliths into vertical ghettos. Elevators stopped working. Heating systems failed every winter. Stairwells turned into open-air toilets and graffiti canvases. And into that vacuum, like water rushing into a sinking ship, came the gangs. The Cobra Stones, a faction of the conservative vice lords, claimed the courtyards and stairwells of The Rock. The gangster disciples and the black disciples controlled other towers. The Mickey Cobras, an old vice lord splinter, ran drug spots so sophisticated that a federal indictment unsealed in 2007 alleged their leader James Austin and his crew had built a fentanyl pipeline running from a clandestine laboratory in Mexico straight into Chicago, a pipeline that the Justice Department said caused multiple fatal overdoses. Younger gangs like the Latin Kings and the New Breed drifted in during the 1990s as the high-rises began to fall. The economy of those buildings was vertical. Stairwells served as lookouts. Hallways became open-air drug markets. Vacant apartments became stash houses, and the Cobra Stones reportedly demanded tribute, a kind of rent, from residents who simply wanted to walk to their own front doors without being shot. Children too young to know what fentanyl was were recruited as runners, ferrying small packages from one floor to another for pocket change. And then came the names that haunted Chicago for decades. In 1992, 7-year-old Dantrell Davis was shot in the head while holding his mother's hand on his way to school, killed by a gangster disciple sniper aiming at a rival who got out of the way. The murder of 9-year-old Shaven Dean would later inspire the supernatural horror film Candyman. Chicago Housing Authority officer Jimmy Haynes was killed trying to do the very job that the rest of Chicago took for granted. The plan for transformation, launched by the city in the late 1990s, finally swung the wrecking ball. Demolition began in 2000 and finished in 2011. Where The Rock once stood, mixed-income townhomes now sit. Whole Foods, coffee shops, dog parks. Some of the original row houses still survive, rehabilitated and tucked between luxury developments like artifacts in a museum nobody asked for. The gangs that ruled those towers have scattered, dispersed across the city, or locked behind federal walls. But Cabrini Green is more than a memory. It is a warning carved in concrete. Robert Taylor Homes, Chicago, Illinois. If Cabrini Green was Chicago's most photographed nightmare, the Robert Taylor homes were Chicago's largest. Stretching 92 acres along State Street on the south side, the complex was completed in 1962, named in honor of the first black chairman of the Chicago Housing Authority. 28 identical 16-story towers lined up like dominoes, designed to house 11,000 people. At its peak, more than 27,000 human beings were crammed inside, mostly black, almost universally poor, almost completely abandoned by the city that put them there. Now picture late March 1994, one single week. Inside that 1 week, Chicago police recorded more than 300 separate gunfire incidents within the boundaries of the Robert Taylor homes. 300 in a single week. A turf war between the gangster disciples and the black disciples had turned the mile-long stretch of high-rises into a literal war zone. Snipers perched in stairwells firing through apartment windows from one tower into the next. One person was killed, 6 were wounded, and tenants spent days hiding under their beds while bullets shattered the glass above them. Some Chicago police officers were so desperate that they openly suggested searching apartments without warrants just to seize the weapons before another body dropped. The towers had become a kingdom of vertical chaos. The gangster disciples, led on paper by the imprisoned Larry Hoover, controlled many of the buildings and used Robert Taylor as a recruiting empire. The black disciples held other towers. By the early 1990s, splinter factions began emerging from inside the parent organizations. One of the most violent of those splinters was a crew called the Hobos. According to the Hobos, originated in the former Robert Taylor homes, formed by factions of both the gangster disciples and the black disciples who had broken away to do their own thing. Smaller crews, the Black P. Stones and the New Breeds, operated in specific corridors and stairwells. The street operations were ruthless and almost industrial in their efficiency. Gang members manned observation posts on high floors, scanning the horizon for rival cars and unmarked police vehicles. Lobbies were patrolled by armed teenagers collecting tolls from anyone who tried to come or go. One particular building at 4429 South Federal Street earned the nicknames Green Monster and Pink Panther, named after the brand-stamped vials of crack cocaine that dealers slung from its windows. A former resident recalled that gang leaders would actually tell children to stay inside when wars erupted and would even organize impromptu reading exercises during quiet moments. They were, in their own twisted way, the only adults paying attention. But that protection came at a terrible price. Tenants were extorted. Witnesses were silenced through threats and worse. The Hobos, federal prosecutors would later allege, racked up multiple murders, attempted murders, robberies, and acts of witness intimidation. Among them was the killing of federal informant Marcus Laney in 2004 and the murder of a man named Keith Daniels in 2007. The 1980s crack epidemic had turned the open-air drug markets along State Street into one of the busiest narcotics hubs in the entire country. The crackdowns came in waves. Operation Closed Market in the early 1990s targeted crack dealers and recovered hundreds of weapons. The 2013 federal indictment of 9 alleged Hobos members charged them with racketeering, drug distribution, and a list of violent offenses long enough to fill a small novel. The bulldozers, however, came faster than the courts. Demolition of the Robert Taylor homes began in 1998 and ended in 2007. By the time the last tower fell, thousands of residents had been scattered to the four corners of the city, most carrying Section 8 vouchers, many never finding stable housing again. Today, where the so-called corridor of death once cast its shadow across State Street, mixed-income developments like Legend South and Oakwood Shores now stand. Townhomes, lawns, bicycles, and driveways. The killing fields of one generation are the playgrounds of another, and almost nobody driving down State Street today realizes that the ground beneath their tires once recorded 300 gunshots in 7 days. Pruitt-Igoe, St. Louis, Missouri. If you have ever seen the iconic black and white footage of an entire high-rise apartment building collapsing in on itself in a slow, almost graceful avalanche of dust and debris, congratulations. You have already met Pruitt-Igoe. That demolition footage, broadcast on televisions across America in the early 1970s, became the universal symbol of public housing failure. But the story behind those few seconds of imploding concrete is much older, much darker, and much more human than any documentary ever captured. Pruitt-Igoe opened in 1954 with the kind of optimism that today reads like a fairy tale. 33 identical 11-story towers designed by architects Minoru Yamasaki and George Helmuth in the modernist Tower in the Park tradition. Originally split along racial lines, the Wendell O. Pruitt homes for black residents and the William L. Igoe apartments for white residents until federal desegregation rulings forced the two halves to merge. White families fled almost immediately. Working-class black families moved in, but the maintenance budget that the city had promised never quite materialized. By the late 1960s, the place looked like the set of a post-apocalyptic film. Barbed wire fences surrounded the buildings. Junkies climbed onto rooftops to tear copper pipes out of the plumbing and sell the metal for scrap, leaving water cascading down stairwells like indoor waterfalls. By 1966, only about a quarter of the apartments were even occupied. Time described the complex as a ghost town, a haven for junkies and muggers, with children forming street gangs that smashed elevators and broke windows for sport. Tenants slept in their bathtubs to avoid stray bullets. They barricaded their doors with furniture every night. Into that vacuum came the dealers. Local crews like the Wrecking Crew and the Checkerboard Square Boys terrorized residents, stealing appliances and demanding payment for safe passage. But the truly serious money belonged to two heroin kingpins whose names still carry weight in St. Louis legend. James Harold Fats Woods controlled an apartment near the complex. Earl Williams Jr., a former Marine sniper, lived inside one of the high-rises themselves, guarded by armed sentinels and stocked with sawed-off shotguns. Williams had ensconced himself inside Pruitt-Igoe like a feudal warlord, using the dying complex as a fortified base from which to import heroin from Texas and Chicago and distribute it across Missouri. By the early 1970s, more than 3/4 of the unit stood empty, their windows blown out, their doors hanging from broken hinges. The complex had become something between a haunted house and a heroin supermarket. The rivalries inside Pruitt-Igoe were fierce, but often petty. Crews fought over which abandoned apartments would serve as their next stash spots. Woods' organization clashed with smaller crews, trying to skim profits off the top. Machine gun fire sometimes echoed through the courtyards at night, and the police, when they responded at all, did so cautiously, often refusing to enter individual buildings without serious backup. Mayors complained, editorials raged. Federal officials toured the site and shook their heads, but the rot had gone too deep. The city had given up. In 1972, less than 20 years after the first family moved in, demolition began. The first tower came down on March 16th of that year. The cameras were rolling. Architecture students would later call that moment the death of modernism. By 1976, every single building had been imploded. The 57-acre site sat vacant for decades, slowly turning into an urban forest where deer would occasionally be spotted wandering between the trees that had grown up through cracked foundation slabs. The federal government was so shaken by the failure that it shifted its housing strategy almost immediately, moving away from giant high-rise projects and towards Section 8 vouchers that allowed low-income families to rent in the private market. Today, in 2026, much of the Pruitt-Igoe site still sits undeveloped, though plans for a national geospatial intelligence facility and mixed-use redevelopment are slowly inching forward. The gangs are long gone, the dealers are dead or imprisoned, but Pruitt-Igoe lingers in the collective memory as the moment America had to admit, on national television, that something it had built had failed catastrophically. Queens, New York cross the East River from Manhattan, slip beneath the steel bones of the Queensboro Bridge, and you'll find yourself standing in the shadow of the largest public housing development in North America, Queensbridge Houses. 26 Y-shaped 6-story buildings spanning more than 3 city blocks, originally opened in 1939 with rent starting at $22.75 for a 4.5-room apartment. The complex was designed to maximize light and air for working-class families of every race. For a few decades, it actually worked, but fast forward to a hot summer afternoon in July 2020. A school teacher named George Rosa, 34 years old, is walking through the Queensbridge courtyard carrying his groceries home. He turns a corner. Suddenly, 2 young gunmen come sprinting across the open space, firing at someone running ahead of them. One of those bullets, fired by men who did not know him and did not care, finds George Rosa's abdomen. He goes down with his groceries spilled around him. Surveillance footage from NYCHA cameras would later show the shooters chasing their target through lobbies and stairwells while residents threw themselves to the ground. Rosa died there in the courtyard. Police would later confirm the shooting stemmed from a feud between 2 crews known as the Jet Blue and the Mac Ballers. Those 2 names tell you everything you need to know about how Queensbridge changed. By the 1950s, NYCHA had quietly moved its higher income tenants out. And by the 1980s, the development was overwhelmingly African American and Latino, deeply impoverished and battered by the crack epidemic that swept New York like a hurricane. The buildings produced legends in 2 parallel universes. In one universe, Queensbridge gave birth to some of the most influential hip-hop artists in American history: Nas, Mobb Deep, Marley Marl, Cormega, Tragedy Khadafi. The complex's beats and bars defined a generation of New York rap. In the other universe, the same hallways became the chessboard for a vicious turf war. The Jet Blue and Mac Ballers gangs dominated different sections of Queensbridge and battled over territory, while just across Vernon Boulevard in the Ravenswood Houses, a third crew called Money the Motivation, also known as Obligated to Money or MTM/OTM, ran their own drug spots and clashed with the Queensbridge crews regularly. The DA's office described it as a 3-way feud, with each crew using social media to taunt the others, posting drill rap videos that flaunted weapons and mocked rivals. The drug economy of Queensbridge shifted with the times. Heroin in the 80s, crack cocaine in the 90s, by the 2000s, fentanyl. A 2016 federal indictment unsealed in the Eastern District of New York exposed a Queensbridge-based crew distributing more than 400 grams of fentanyl and over 280 grams of crack. Wiretaps captured crew members boasting that the pills would feed up the projects. That same crew was tied to the overdose death of a mother in West Virginia, a chilling reminder that what happened inside Queensbridge did not stay there. In 2018, the NYPD launched an undercover operation with a name that landed like a punchline: Operation "The Bridge is Over," a sly reference to a famous diss track. The sweep resulted in 22 arrests, the seizure of 4 firearms, and roughly 10,000 vials of heroin pulled from lobbies, stairwells, and outdoor benches. Then in August 2021, the Queens DA's office indicted 28 alleged members of JetBlue, MacBallers, and MTM/OTM on charges including murder, attempted murder, and weapons possession. The investigation, which had begun in 2018 and expanded after the pandemic surge in violence, used wiretaps, surveillance, and informant testimony to map out the gang's communication channels. Today, Queensbridge still stands. Cameras mounted on lampposts, improved lighting, community organizations running mentorship programs across Vernon Boulevard, luxury condominiums tower over the development, casting literal shadows on the brown brick buildings. Gentrification has remade Long Island City into a high-rise playground for tech workers. While inside Queensbridge, poverty and gang tension still simmer. It is a paradox of New York. A complex that produced Illmatic also produced indictments. The same hallways that gave the world some of its greatest verses are still being haunted by the gunfire those verses described. Travel to South Los Angeles, past the palm trees that line the boulevards like postcard props, past the murals dedicated to fallen homies, faded by the relentless California sun, to a 700-unit complex called Jordan Downs in the Watts neighborhood. By the mid-1980s, Jordan Downs had become a fortress of a kind that no civic planner had ever intended. Crack cocaine had hit Los Angeles like a meteor, and the men inside Jordan Downs had figured out how to harvest it. The Grape Street Watts Crips, born originally in the 1950s as a mixed black and Latino youth gang near Jordan Downs, transformed under the leadership of Wayne Honcho Day into something resembling a paramilitary drug cartel. Apartments inside the project were converted into fortified crack houses with reinforced doors and gun ports cut into walls. Dealers wore bulletproof vests inside their own homes. Pit bulls patrolled the stairwells. Police scanners crackled in every kitchen, monitoring the LAPD's Southeast Division for any sign of incoming raids. Honcho's brother, Brian Peanut Day, and his cousin Louis Lil Louis Smith helped run the empire. The gang allied with other Crip sets through an umbrella organization called the Consolidated Crip Organization and forged ties with Mexican cartels. Jordan Downs began life modestly enough. Built in the 1940s as temporary housing for steelworkers during World War II, it was converted into public housing by the Los Angeles Housing Authority after the war ended. By the 1970s, deindustrialization had wiped out the steel jobs. White flight had emptied the neighborhood of most non-black residents. The 1965 Watts Uprising had cemented Watts in the national imagination as a symbol of black urban rage. The 1993 film Menace to Society used the project as a backdrop, and rapper J Rock, born and raised in those very buildings, would later put Grape Street on the global map. The street operations of the Grape Street Crips functioned like a vertically integrated business. Honcho Day and his lieutenants operated clandestine PCP labs out in the desert, then moved the finished product into Jordan Downs for distribution. Apartments served as cooking houses for crack production. Armed sentries posted on stairwells challenged anyone who didn't belong. Independent dealers were taxed for the privilege of operating in Grape Street territory, and those who refused to pay were beaten or worse. The gang built distribution networks reaching as far as Memphis, Tennessee, sending PCP across state lines like a Fortune 500 company expanding its market share. The rivalries that defined Jordan Downs were almost biblical in their persistence. The biggest of all was the war between the Grape Street Crips and the bounty hunter Bloods of nearby Nickerson Gardens. The two projects sat just over a mile apart, separated by streets that became kill zones. Drive-by shootings along 97th Street and 103rd Street became routine. Gun battles between the two gangs left bodies strewn between the buildings during the worst stretches of the 1980s. Children walking to school learned which streets to avoid by watching where the chalk outlines appeared the following morning. The crackdowns came in waves, but rarely landed clean blows. In March 2008, the U.S. Department of Justice unsealed a 10-count indictment charging 12 members of the Grape Street Crips with conspiracy to manufacture and distribute PCP. Authorities seized a clandestine laboratory in the desert and a stash house in Watts containing gallons of precursor chemicals. The case was part of a larger Safe Streets Task Force initiative aimed at dismantling Grape Street's narcotics empire. The LAPD installed surveillance cameras throughout the project. The Community Safety Partnership, an experimental program assigning officers to build long-term relationships with residents, took root. In 2015, that fragile peace shattered. Around 2 in the afternoon on a Sunday, Grape Street affiliate Clinton J.B. Givens was shot in Nickerson Gardens. Hours later, a teenage boy was killed near Jordan Downs in apparent retaliation. The whole community held its breath, certain that another full-scale war was about to ignite. Cooler heads plus relentless police presence eventually contained it. Today, Jordan Downs is undergoing a multi-phase redevelopment into a mixed-income neighborhood with new apartments, retail spaces, and green parks. Many original residents have been temporarily relocated, and community activists have raised legitimate concerns about whether they will ever be able to afford to move back. The fortified crack houses, the PCP labs, and the open-air drug markets that defined Jordan Downs in its darkest era have largely been bulldozed into history. Nickerson Gardens, Watts, Los Angeles. If Jordan Downs was the Crip Kingdom, Nickerson Gardens was the blood empire that sat across the street glaring back. Built in 1955, Nickerson Gardens is the largest public housing development west of the Mississippi River. More than 1,000 units of red brick low-rises arranged in long parallel rows like a small city built specifically to house poverty. After the 1965 Watts uprising, the surrounding neighborhood collapsed into a state of permanent neglect. Out of that neglect, in 1969 was born a gang that would become one of the most feared in the entire history of Los Angeles. The Bounty Hunter Bloods, or BHB, founded inside Nickerson Gardens itself, became one of the largest blood sets in the city. BHB members engaged in assault, kidnapping, drug dealing, and murder, and viewed the Crips, including the Grape Street Crips just down the road in Jordan Downs, as eternal enemies. The territory of the Bounty Hunter Bloods encompassed every courtyard, every alley, every parking lot, and every staircase of Nickerson Gardens. Walking into that complex without permission was, for decades, a genuine roll of the dice. Now imagine August 17th, 2021. Calvin Peele, 39 years old, pulls his car up to Nickerson Gardens to drop off school clothes for his young son. He has done this kind of thing dozens of times. He steps out of the driver's side door. A black sedan slides up beside him. A gunman emerges, opens fire, hits Peele and his son. Then, in an act of cold finality that detectives would later describe as execution style, the shooter stands over Peele's wounded body and fires again before fleeing the scene. According to, Peele was 37 years old at the time, and detectives suspected the killing was tied to ongoing feuds among the Bounty Hunter Bloods and rival gangs. His son survived. His father did not. Nickerson Gardens became a national reference point for crack cocaine economics. Bounty Hunter Bloods members cooked powder cocaine into crack at stash houses inside the project itself, then sold it hand-to-hand in the lobbies and outdoor walkways. Lookout children warned of approaching police. Leaders like Damian Fats Baker recruited accomplices, directed sales, and stored firearms inside apartments. The federal prosecution noted that Baker used a residence inside Nickerson Gardens as both a stash house and a command center for cooking operations. The rivalries followed a predictable pattern. The Bounty Hunter Bloods feuded with the Grape Street Crips of Jordan Downs across the way. They feuded with the Pi Rouge sets out of Imperial Courts. They feuded with the 10-Line Bloods. Nearly every shooting along 103rd Street had a backstory rooted in some retaliation for some prior insult or murder, and the cycle spun on for decades. In April 2021, federal authorities launched Operation Loyalty Matters, a multi-agency sweep targeting BHB at Nickerson Gardens. According to the Justice Department's press release, 22 BHB members were indicted for cooking and selling crack cocaine, while officers seized 26 firearms, several kilograms of crack and methamphetamine, and significant quantities of cash. The case was, by Los Angeles standards, one of the most aggressive federal interventions in Watts in recent memory. Then in December 2023, Damian Fats Baker was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison for leading the conspiracy. Prosecutors detailed how Baker had recruited accomplices, directed sales operations, and used his Nickerson Gardens residence as the operational nerve center for the entire enterprise. Yet the violence has not stopped. The shooting of Clinton J.B. Givens in 2015 inside Nickerson Gardens, paired with a retaliatory killing near Jordan Downs that same evening, demonstrated how easily the Watts ceasefire could collapse. The 2021 execution of Calvin Peele reminded the city that the Bounty Hunter Bloods were not finished. Today, Nickerson Gardens remains standing. Unlike Cabrini Green or Robert Taylor or Pruitt-Igoe, the wrecking ball never came. The Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles has renovated some units. Community programs offer alternatives for young people who might otherwise drift toward the gang life that swallowed their parents and grandparents. Targeted policing and the LAPD's Community Safety Partnership have lowered crime statistics modestly. But Nickerson Gardens remains the spiritual home of the Bounty Hunter Bloods, and that lineage is not erased by paint or programming. Now leave the residential battlegrounds of Watts and travel north to downtown Los Angeles. Right where the office towers cast their long shadows across the cracked sidewalks, you will find a 50-block area unlike anywhere else in America. Skid Row. This is not a housing project. This is something stranger and arguably more troubling. This is what happens when a city decides quietly and over the course of decades that there will be one neighborhood where it will simply give up. On any weekday morning in early 2026, San Pedro Street resembles a refugee camp built inside a city. Tents stretch from one corner to the next, tarps strung between dumpsters and fences. Inside makeshift shelters, dealers hand out fentanyl pills and small bags of methamphetamine. The smell of burnt foil drifts on the breeze. Sirens wail constantly but rarely actually stop. Members of the 18th Street Gang have been extorting these street vendors for years. A leader known by the alias Whiskey reportedly demanded protection money from anyone hoping to sell narcotics inside the territory. Refusal meant beatings. Refusal meant bullets. Skid Row's origins as a containment zone go back more than a century. Mission churches and cheap single-room occupancy hotels once housed transient workers, traveling laborers, men chasing seasonal jobs in shipping or canning. By the 1970s, deinstitutionalization had pushed thousands of mentally ill Americans out of state hospitals and into the streets, and Los Angeles policy quietly directed homeless services into this one cluster of blocks east of downtown, the area calcified. By the 1990s, it had become an open-air encampment, and by the 2010s, fentanyl arrived to make everything dramatically worse. The 18th Street Gang, a transnational organization with deep ties to the Mexican mafia, recognized the economic opportunity faster than the city did. Skid Row's territory is divided into sections by street gangs from South Los Angeles who control the markets for meth, heroin, prostitution, cigarettes, and stolen goods. The 18th Street Gang sits at the top of that hierarchy. Gang members extort drug distributors by demanding payment to sell inside Skid Row, and those who refuse, according to the federal indictment, are met with violence. The drug pipeline runs from MacArthur Park, just a few miles to the west, straight into Skid Row. Federal officials described a free flow of narcotics between MacArthur Park and Skid Row in their announcement of the 2026 indictment. Single fentanyl pills change hands for a few dollars. Plastic baggies of meth get bartered for stolen merchandise lifted from downtown stores. Homeless addicts often finance their next dose by recycling cans, picking pockets, or shoplifting from the very same retail corridors that the office workers patronize during lunch hour. The rivalries on Skid Row tend to be quieter than in housing projects because 18th Street's dominance is so total. Smaller cliques like the Florence and the Crazy Riders have attempted to muscle in over the years, only to be driven out by beatings, shootings, and intimidation. Extortion payments keep an uneasy peace among the vendors. Homeless individuals sometimes form informal protective crews around their tent clusters, but these are no match for organized gang violence. The crackdowns have come and gone. The Safer Cities initiative in 2006 deployed hundreds of LAPD officers into Skid Row, generating thousands of arrests but few permanent changes. Critics accused the city of criminalizing homelessness. Then, in March 2026, federal prosecutors unsealed indictments against 18th Street Gang members for murder, extortion, and drug trafficking. The case, described as one of the largest organized crime crackdowns in Los Angeles in years, followed years of surveillance, undercover buys, and informant cooperation. Whether it actually changes anything on the streets is another question entirely. Mayor Karen Bass's Inside Safe program has tried to move people from sidewalks into hotels, but many return to the encampments within weeks. Tent fires kill several people each year. Diseases that should have been wiped out generations ago, like tuberculosis and typhus, occasionally resurface among the population. The community groups doing outreach work, the harm reduction nurses handing out clean needles, the religious volunteers serving meals from folding tables, all describe a humanitarian crisis hiding in plain sight inside the second largest city in America. Skid Row is not a housing project, but functionally, it is the worst administered neighborhood in the United States, run by a gang the federal government openly acknowledges controls the streets. Sandtown-Winchester, Baltimore, Maryland. Move east past the cornfields of Pennsylvania, past the rolling hills of suburban Maryland, into the heart of West Baltimore, where row houses with marble stoops once held the dreams of black families who came north during the Great Migration. This is Sandtown-Winchester, a historic African-American neighborhood that produced Cab Calloway and Thurgood Marshall, that once buzzed with jazz clubs and barbershops and Sunday morning churches whose choirs could be heard for blocks, and that, by the late 20th century, had been so thoroughly hollowed out by redlining, deindustrialization, highway construction, and white flight that entire blocks stood vacant, plywood sealed, and slowly collapsing into themselves. On June 23, 2023, Baltimore police executed search warrants on the 1700 block of North Carey Street. Officers in marked tactical gear used battering rams to enter row houses and seize firearms, 1,100 vials of cocaine, 1,500 gel capsules of fentanyl, more than 3 kilograms of drugs packaged for sale, and approximately $200,000 in cash. 8 men were arrested, all members of a drug trafficking organization that called itself the Carey Boys. The Carey Boys are not the most famous gang to come out of Sandtown-Winchester. That dubious honor belongs to a crew called Trained to Go, also referred to as TTG, which emerged in the early 2000s as a violent offshoot of the Black Guerrilla family, the prison-based organization that has long exerted influence over Baltimore's streets. Federal prosecutors described TTG's leader, Montana Baronet, as Baltimore's #1 trigger puller. TTG members were ultimately convicted of 7 murders and an array of drug charges, with Baronet himself sentenced to life in prison. The #1 trigger puller phrase reverberated through Baltimore for years afterward. TTG members had murdered rivals, suspected informants, and innocent bystanders alike. The gang was linked to at least 10 killings going back to 2010. When TTG affiliate Gregory Fennell was murdered, Baronet ordered a retaliatory shooting that killed an innocent man caught in the crossfire. The cycle spun on for years before federal prosecutors finally locked the cell doors. But Sandtown-Winchester's place in American consciousness was not cemented by TTG or by the Carey Boys. It was cemented in April 2015 when a young man named Freddie Gray was loaded into a Baltimore police van after a foot chase, suffered a fatal spinal injury during the ride, and died days later in a hospital bed. Sandtown was the neighborhood Gray called home. The protests that followed his death, the riots that consumed parts of West Baltimore, the burning CVS that became an international news image, all of it traced its origins to the same poverty, disinvestment, and tense police-community relations that had defined Sandtown for half a century. The Department of Justice opened a civil rights investigation into the Baltimore Police Department, ultimately producing a federal consent decree that required reforms across the entire force. Sandtown-Winchester's gangs followed classic East Coast open-air market tactics. TTG and other crews controlled corners along North Avenue and Monroe Street, using juveniles as lookouts and runners. Abandoned row houses served as stash sites and shooting galleries, while the Carey Boys operated almost exclusively on the 1700 block of North Carey Street, selling cocaine and fentanyl to foot traffic and curbside drivers. The 2023 raid resulted from a 5-month investigation by the Baltimore Police Department's Group Violence Unit, built on surveillance, controlled buys, and informant cooperation. Sandtown's drug economy evolved over decades, from cocaine and heroin in the 90s to fentanyl in the 2000s, which drove overdose deaths sharply higher. The Carey Boys packaged the drug in gel capsules for consistent dosing, yet its potency still killed customers. Today, the neighborhood continues to struggle, with many boarded-up row houses and some of Baltimore's highest vacancy rates. Yet signs of hope have emerged. Community urban gardens in vacant lots, murals on collapsing walls, trickle-in redevelopment money, police reforms under the federal consent decree, and declining violence since TTG's takedown, though drug markets persist in pockets. Across the Delaware River from Philadelphia, the Ben Franklin Bridge arcs above you like a steel rainbow. On the far side sits Camden, New Jersey, a city that for years held the dubious title of America's most dangerous city, repeatedly ranked at the top of every grim list that anybody bothered to compile. A city that once thrived on shipbuilding and manufacturing, and that, by the 1990s, had been so thoroughly abandoned by industry that its tax base had collapsed and its police department was running on fumes. At sunrise on November 28, 2018, FBI agents and Camden County police officers converged on the 400 and 500 blocks of Pine Street. They used battering rams to enter row houses and arrested more than a dozen suspects belonging to a sophisticated drug trafficking organization. Wiretaps and surveillance had revealed a network distributing crack cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl across Camden, and the structure of the operation was almost corporate. Suppliers, packagers, runners, shift managers, set workers, each role defined, each handoff scripted. The organization had moved its operations to Pine Street after a fatal shooting on Fillmore Street in 2017 prompted increased police presence in their old territory. Camden's collapse had been engineered over decades. The shipyards closed. The Campbell Soup factories laid off workers. The RCA plant shut down. White flight emptied the row houses. The remaining population, predominantly Black and Latino, found itself trapped in a city with disappearing tax revenue, deteriorating schools, and a police department so under-resourced that, by 2013, the city dissolved its municipal force entirely and replaced it with a county-run department. Long before the 2018 Pine Street takedown, Camden had developed an entire crime ecosystem. Various street gangs affiliated with the Bloods, the Crips, the Latin Kings, and even MS-13 operated in different neighborhoods, but the most influential criminal organization in Camden during the 2000s was a family-run enterprise. The Urbina brothers built open-air drug markets in North Camden that controlled corners at 4th and York Streets for nearly 20 years. They moved hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of heroin and cocaine each month, used violence to defend their turf, and even allowed other dealers to rent the corners for a fee. The enterprise had grown so large that it forged ties to Mexican drug cartels. The Pine Street organization, dismantled in the 2018 takedown, operated with similar discipline. Its leader, Ronnie Lopez, obtained bulk quantities of heroin, crack, and fentanyl. Packagers like Carlos Perez prepared the drugs for street-level sale. Runners such as Juan Figueroa transported product to shift managers, who supervised set workers conducting hand-to-hand sales to foot traffic and drivers. The drug trafficking organization, prosecutors alleged, was tied to multiple fatal overdoses in Camden, including 2 specifically documented in the indictment. The most publicized incident tied to the organization was the 2017 shooting on Fillmore Street that killed 2 undercover plainclothes officers. That tragedy galvanized federal investigators. Wiretaps captured Pine Street members discussing weapons and bragging about their willingness to use violence. The eventual indictment charged 19 people with distributing at least 280 grams of crack, 1 kilogram of heroin, and significant quantities of fentanyl and cocaine. Operation North Pole, executed years earlier in 2013, had taken down the Urbina brothers' empire. 3 of the brothers were ultimately sentenced to lengthy federal prison terms. The indictment in that case charged 42 defendants and revealed the open-air markets where, for years, addicts had lined up like commuters at a transit station to buy the day's heroin or crack. New Jersey state prosecutors emphasized that the Urbinas had ruled their corners through intimidation and violence, treating the streets of Camden like personal fiefdoms. Camden also did something rare in 2013. It dissolved its own police department and replaced it with the Camden County Police Department, a county-run agency that implemented community policing strategies, foot patrols, and neighborhood relationship building. Homicide rates dropped meaningfully in the years following the transition. New businesses returned to the waterfront. Universities expanded their downtown campuses. Some neighborhoods like Whitman Park still struggle. Drug markets still operate in pockets. Poverty still defines whole stretches of the city. But Camden's slow rebound has become a case study in police reform. The story of how a city dissolved its own law enforcement agency, rebuilt it from scratch, and saw its violent crime rate decline as a result is now studied in policing schools and city halls across the country. Whether the Camden model can be replicated and whether the underlying poverty that produced gangs like the Urbina's empire and the Pine Street organization can ever be fully addressed are questions that remain stubbornly open. For our final stop, cross back across the Mississippi River, away from the gleaming gateway arch of St. Louis to the eastern bank, into a small Illinois city that for decades has worn the unwanted crown of one of America's most dangerous places per capita. East St. Louis, once a thriving industrial powerhouse anchored by stockyards, railroad terminals, and chemical plants, the city has been hemorrhaging population and tax base since World War II. By the 1980s, East St. Louis was nearly bankrupt. By the 1990s, it had developed one of the highest homicide rates in America. By the 2000s, federal investigators had begun pulling at the threads of an organized criminal enterprise that had been quietly running drugs through the city for years. In March 2013, a shootout erupted inside a modest home in East St. Louis. Rival gang members traded gunfire across the rooms, leaving bullet holes scattered across walls and shell casings clattering across the floor. Responding officers recovered multiple assault rifles from the home, which investigators later identified as a drug house operated by a man named Ayiko Paulette. The shootout was just one bloody chapter in a much longer investigation that would eventually expose Paulette as a key leader of the Waverly Crips, an East St. Louis-based gang running cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin distribution throughout the metropolitan area. The Waverly Crips formed in East St. Louis in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Ayiko Paulette helped found the gang and by 2012 was leading it and managing its drug trade. The Waverly Crips built ties to national Crip networks while controlling local drug markets in East St. Louis and the neighboring municipality of Washington Park. Other gangs operated alongside them: the Gangster Disciples, the Vice Lords, the Black P. Stones, all vying for territory in a city where economic opportunity had nearly evaporated. The street operations of the Waverly Crips relied on a small network of drug houses scattered throughout the city. Cocaine and methamphetamine, imported from Texas through a supply chain that federal investigators painstakingly reconstructed over years, were stored in residences, repackaged for street sale and distributed by runners. Paulette controlled sales operations in Washington Park and employed multiple people in his enterprise. He was, in the language of the federal indictment, both the boss and the enforcer. What made the case especially troubling was the way Paulette tried to operate even from behind bars. According to the Justice Department, while held in custody pending trial, Paulette directed others to intimidate a potential witness in the case against him. East St. Louis' notoriety also came from a larger structural failure. For years, the city's police department was so underfunded that response times stretched into hours. Patrol cars were routinely out of service. Multiple officers were indicted across the years for assisting drug traffickers, taking bribes, or covering up evidence. The Waverly Crips shootout in March 2013 was emblematic of a city where, as residents had been saying for years, calling 911 could mean waiting an hour for a response or no response at all. The crackdown finally came in January 2016. Paulette was sentenced to 300 months, that's 25 years, in federal prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, maintaining a drug-involved premises, firearms offenses, and obstruction of justice. The rivalries that defined East St. Louis followed familiar patterns. Conflicts between the Waverly Crips, the Gangster Disciples, and the Vice Lords erupted over drug corners. Shootings occurred along Missouri Avenue and inside small housing complexes scattered across the city. Rival gangs from St. Louis proper occasionally crossed the Mississippi to push into East St. Louis territory, prompting retaliation in both directions. Today, East St. Louis remains deeply impoverished. The population continues to decline. Some redevelopment projects have aimed to attract logistics companies given the city's location near major rail and highway networks, but progress has been slow. Violent crime has decreased somewhat since the mid-2000s, but the homicide rate remains stubbornly high. East St. Louis stands as a reminder that in some American cities, what appeared to be a temporary downturn quietly hardened into a permanent crisis, one that has yet to fully lift.